Hi, this is James Rollins, and this is the story behind my stories.
You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Charlene Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
James Rollins.
You can find all of the archives of the show over at hankgarner.com. And when you're there, please click on the links on the right-hand sidebar to subscribe to the show. That way you don't miss an episode. Thank you to all of our sponsors. We're going to be telling you about them throughout the show for making the show possible. If you would like to sponsor the show, go to hankgarner.com and click on the link to advertise. It's up in the top menu bar. There's a brand new collection I'd like to tell you about. It's called Chronicles of Mirestone. 200 years ago, the dwarven clans and the elvish houses of Mirestone were at peace. The king of the dwarves, in a selfish and greedy move, used his wizards to expand their mountain empire, raising new peaks from the forest floors of their elven neighbors. War and hatred ensued. The Chronicles of Mirestone offers a glimpse into the lives of the elves and dwarves living in the aftermath as they seek for a new peace. 6 talented authors lend their voices to a tale of destruction, mistrust, and hope. The Chronicles of Mirestone. We knew it would be bad, but there are levels of bad. There was no scale that could have measured this one. Residents listened as 130-mile-per-hour winds tore away their roofs and struggled to stay alive as water crept into their homes, threatening to drown people in their living rooms. When the winds died and the rain finally stopped, the streets were only navigable by boat. The death toll rose to over 70 and more than 1 million cars flooded with an estimate of $100 billion in destruction. How does a community, a city, a state survive when hit by a monster storm and then have every square inch covered by over 4 feet of water? A storm which can only be described as a 1,000-year flooding event worse than Hurricane Katrina and broke all historical records. Lived through one man's experience as the world grew more and more uncertain. Experienced through the medium of social media the day-by-day visceral experience of watching people's lives permanently altered, and the heart-filling moments when strangers, neighbors, and friends stepped up and helped those in trouble. Watch as needs are met, lives preserved, and hope restored in the 2 months following Harvey. Get your signed paperback copy of 2 Months with Harvey by Terry R. Hill. Go to terryrhill.net. Proceeds from this project are going to benefit people still struggling in the aftermath of Hurricane Harvey. terryrhill.net. 2 Months with Harvey. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have one of my favorite authors on the show. James Rollins joins us tonight. He has a brand new book coming out December 5th called The Demon Crown, which is a Sigma Force novel. Which one is this one, James?
This is number 13.
Number 13.
Unlucky number 13.
That's excellent. I've been reading the advanced reader copy. It is fantastic in standard Sigma Force style. And we're going to dig all into that in just a few minutes. But James, we begin each show with the same question. And that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or a storyteller?
You know, I grew up reading a lot when I was a kid. I always sort of joked that I judged the amount I was reading not by the number of books I read, but the number of inches that books would take up on my bookshelf. And so one of the first books I ever read was Tarzan of the Apes by Edgar Rice Burroughs. And I was really intrigued by the fact that at the back of the novel there was a sort of ape to English translation guide, so like you can potentially learn to speak ape. So when I read that, I thought, that's so cool. I want to be able to learn to speak to animals, because there's a part of me, again, I have my graduate degrees in veterinary medicine, so I still love animals. So I read that book. I remember the first thing when I finished that, and I realized that, gosh, there's actually a ape to English dictionary. I wanted to do the human to dog dictionary. And so I was trying to, even back then, try to craft a story where I could actually build this vocabulary between me and my dog. Now, of course, I was, I think, at third grade by that point, but one of these days I'll accomplish that goal.
So, you said that your degree was in veterinary medicine. Did you practice as a vet?
I did. I practiced for 15 years. And I still, again, it's why a lot of animals end up appearing in my books, is that, that side of my brain that loves animals, loves medicine, loves science, sort of seeps into my other side of my brain that loves to spin these wild stories. I again, from third grade, I knew I wanted to be a veterinarian. I got that assignment that all third grade teachers eventually give their student. Go home, write an essay, a couple paragraphs. What do you want to be when you grow up? I remember that was a point of moral dilemma for the third grade version of myself. I remember sitting at my desk, blank sheet of paper in front of me. Knew I wanted to be a veterinarian. The problem was I didn't know how to spell it. There's the one thing all third graders hate to do. I went and looked at the dictionary. I actually remember doing that. In the dictionary, looking up how to spell veterinarian. So I can finish that essay. If I could put policeman, I could put fireman, I could cheat and do that, but no, I was determined for third grade to be a veterinarian.
Oh, that's so funny. I'm always fascinated by writers. The great majority of us don't set out to be writers per se. There's this storytelling gene that's switched on in some of us, I believe. And then, so you're always a storyteller. There's always that side of you that's always crafting stories, or, gets lost in books and that sort of thing. And then one day, the writer comes out and you want to actually, develop some craft around that desire that you have. From the time you're in the third grade, you wanted to be a veterinarian, but, at what point did, storytelling really kind of come alive to you?
Well, it's always somewhat of the storyteller in my family. I grew up with three brothers and three sisters. We were raised Polish Roman Catholic. To keep the Polish flag in your window, you have to have at least 6 kids. So my mom had a spare. But they were my early audience for my storytelling. My goal was to terrorize my younger brothers and sisters with, these wild, outlandish stories. If tears were involved, even better. My goal was to, see if I can convince them to believe something outlandish and crazy. And pretty much that's all I'm doing today. I'm, spinning these sort of stories that look beyond the edge of the horizon a little bit and trying to convince my readers that it's true. So even back then, and I think you're right in regards to your assessment about writers, is that, and there's no adage, you can't teach somebody to write. And I don't agree with that. I believe that there are tools, readily tools that you can teach somebody so that their prose can become stronger. But I think there's something innate about being a storyteller. I don't know if you can teach somebody to be a storyteller. Either that's something you want to do and that sort of speaks to you from some deeper level, and then you can be taught the craft of how to, pick up these tools you can throw in your toolbox. And but unless you're an innate storyteller, I don't know if that's something that could be taught.
Yeah, it's such a crazy thing that when it's there, it's there. And like you say, I think you can teach people the tools to. I think you can even teach someone to write a pretty good book. But when you read a book and it really catches somebody and grabs them by the heart, you kind of know there's just something that's just different. And I've not ever been able to put my finger on it, but yeah, it's there.
And I agree, and I think that's something in regards to longevity too. I mean, this is my 33rd book that I've written.
Wow. And
I think to survive 33 books, there's a part of you that has to be the storyteller that enjoys doing that, or that's a lot of effort for something that innately is not who you are.
Right. I came to your work through the Sigma series and through this really wonderful blend of action, adventure, conspiracy, cutting edge science. It's just kind of got all the things that push my buttons all wrapped into one. And it wasn't until much later that I actually realized that you wrote other stuff, and you wrote fantasy and a lot of other stuff. So when you were a kid, what sorts of books really grabbed your attention?
Well, it was, one of the, there's an old adage that, whatever music you liked when you were in high school is the music you pretty much liked the rest of your life. And I think that applies to authors too, is that, whatever we sort of like to read when we're in high school or our formative years is the tendency what we tend to write today. And so, I read everything. And I wasn't necessarily, I loved science fiction, I loved fantasy, I loved horror. I would say I was more in the genre. I loved mysteries, loved sort of military thrillers like Clive Cussler or Tom Clancy. Didn't necessarily like literary fiction. I was leaning always more towards the genre fiction. So when I began writing, I didn't know what to write because I liked so many different genres. I wrote a thriller, and my first novel, Subterranean. And during the process of trying to get that published, I was rejected by 49 different agents. It was actually my 50th agent that saw something in that work that maybe we can get this published. But during that process, I thought, well, maybe I'm not a thriller writer. Maybe I'm a fantasy writer. So I jumped ship and wrote fantasy at that point while I was shopping Subterranean around. And then lo and behold, about when I was finishing up the fantasy, Subterranean got picked up by HarperCollins. And within a week, Del Rey picked up my fantasy for their publishing house. So within a week, I went from an unpublished veterinarian working the day job to all of a sudden having, two different careers, two different pen names, two different genres, two different publishing houses. So it was quite strange. And even today, my books are a little bit hard to categorize in that, there's a little bit of science fiction, there's a little bit of historical fiction, there's a bit of spy thriller, spycraft in there, there's a bit of adventure. I remember I think I had written, about 10 novels for HarperCollins, and I was finally called to New York, and this is my first time I had my editor face-to-face. She had edited 10 of my books, and I had never met her. And this was my first time to meet my editor. And so I met the entire sort of up echelon of Harper at that point. At the end of the table was head of HarperCollins, and there was a marketing department, the sales department, there's a paperback division, there was a foreign division. Everybody's on this big, long conference table. And there's me at one end and the head of HarperCollins at the other, and the head of HarperCollins stands up and goes, Jim, we published 10 of your books, and we just have one question. And I go, what? He goes, well, what are you writing? Because they weren't quite sure how to classify my writing either. So,
oh, my goodness. So what is your answer to that?
I don't know if I have an answer. I play with that. Scientific thriller, action. I have a hard time pinpointing word. And I've gone to bookstores, but they seem to be a little bit baffled by where they're going to shelf me. I've seen my books in science fiction. I've seen my books in mysteries. I've seen my books in thrillers. I've seen my books in just general fiction. So apparently it's a bit challenging to figure out how to pigeonhole me.
You said that you originally set out to be a thriller writer. That's what you thought you were going to do. What was the motivation for writing that first book? You said you were rejected by 49 agents. Did one day you're giving shots to dogs and decide, I'm going to write a novel, or how did that kind of come about for you?
It was a slow process. I knew even from when I was going to vet school, one night while I was doing the midnight to 8 a.m. shift in the ER at the veterinary teaching hospital. Basically, it's just you and a panel of animals that you're giving meds to or just monitoring. And it was a very sort of I think I only had 2 patients at that point that night. And so to keep myself awake, I wrote a short story during that period of time. So even then, I still loved spitting stories, and I thought, I didn't think it was a career. I thought it wouldn't be cool at some point to walk into a bookstore and see my book on the shelf, just one book. And I thought that'd be a really cool goal. But, I graduated, and the reality of your first year out of vet school, you're the low man on the totem pole, you get the long hours, you have to carry the emergency shift, you carry the beeper around. And then I started my own business, and now I got the business hat I'm wearing. So I never seemed to have any time in which to fit writing into my life. And then eventually my practice that I started got busy enough that I could hire my first vet. Life got just incrementally less busy. And I thought, well, in that tiny little sliver of availability, I'm going to write. And so I joined a writing group in Sacramento. Because, again, I had no formal training in writing. If you read any of my books, you'll go, he's had no formal training in writing. And I thought, one of these I better get some, better learn a few of those tools to throw in my toolbox. And so I joined this writing club in Sacramento, and they had a critique group. It's a large sort of group, of maybe I think 200 members, but then that was broken down to little select critique groups. And so I joined the critique group. That's sort of speculative fiction critique group, and began sort of workshopping short stories initially, because that's all I thought I could fit within the spectrum of a little gap of time in which I happened to have free. And then I submitted a short story, and it got rejected. None of my short stories, before I got my book published, ever got published. So I collected a lot of rejections, and I was diligent about sending out those short stories, but nothing ever got published. But I did receive a nice note from Marion Zimmer Bradley before she passed away. She had a magazine anthology called Realms of Fantasy, and I submitted a short story to her magazine, and she was kind enough to reject it. But she actually took the time to write me a personal note. And in that note she says, Jim, I've read your short story. I see that you have the chops to be a writer, but I don't think you're a short story writer. I think just from reading your short story, fundamentally, I think you're wired more to be a novelist. Now, I could take that one of two ways. Either Marion Zimmer Bradley was saying politely, quit sending us these bad short stories, go do something else and leave us alone, or maybe she's right. So, of course, I'm going to think maybe she's right, because I realized that I don't enjoy reading a lot of short fiction. I prefer novels, and the longer the novels, the better. If it's a doorstopper novel, even better. If it's a series, even better again. So I think growing up reading novel after novel, series or big novels, is that I think that somehow that hardwired my brain to thinking of storytelling in long format. And so I took her at her word and decided, well, I'm going to stop writing these short stories. I'm going to write my first novel. And that was Subterranean. And so based upon her recommendation is what got my career started.
Wow. I'm glad you brought that up about short stories and novels, because it is a different skill set in writing those two pieces. And sometimes, and it also depends on the story, because sometimes a story needs to be kind of one scene or a limited scope, and maybe to be a little open-ended. If you're some stories need to kind of let the reader stew on it a little bit afterwards, and to maybe not wrap up so tightly. And then a novel, on the other hand, gives you the room to have multiple storylines, and then to bring some tight resolution at the end, and kind of an aha moment and things like that. You have gone on to write and publish several short stories, and some of them that tied novels together and that sorts of things. Do you approach those two things differently when you set out to do one or the other?
I do, and that I do need to recognize that, again, my brain is wired for those big format stories, but I know that when I'm writing a short story that I need to get laser focused. It's got to be a limited number of characters, generally one or two, and the threat needs to come right on page one, and generally, I think even for a short story, there should be a beginning, middle, and end, and so usually my novels, I'll have even when I'm structuring my novels, I know the beginning, I know the end, I know the three tent poles that are going to hold up my story. I know the big action set pieces that are going to occur in this novel. And I don't necessarily know how A connects to B when I'm beginning that novel, but I at least know those tent poles. So when I'm doing a short story, I'll know the beginning and the end, and I'll know the tent pole in the middle, and then that's what I work from. I just use one tent pole instead of three, and I keep it limited. One or two characters, and the jeopardy needs to be on page one.
Right, exactly. I'm interested to know, during the submission time when you were shopping for an agent and you were rejected by 49, what kind of time frame was that in? How long did that shopping last?
Now, I was submitting multiple submissions, and again, I'm pretty structured. Even today, when it comes to writing, my writing's structured. Even when I was submitting, it was structured. I made sure that I submitted 10 submissions to 10 different agents, and that whenever I got a rejection from one of the agents, I would send out the same number to new agents. So if I got two rejections in the mailbox, I'd send out 2 new submissions. If I got 3, I'd send out 3. If I got 1, I'd get 1. So I always had 10 floating out there. They were my way of insulating myself against that rejection, so that even if I got one rejection. There's still 9 more floating out there. So it takes a little bit of that sting out of the rejection. So, but all said and done, it still took me probably about 4 months, because it takes a while to get the whole process. Usually you'll submit a query letter, then they'll ask for a partial, which is the first 50 pages in an outline, and then if they like that, they'll ask for the whole novel. So it takes a while to get to that. And sometimes I got rejected at the first level, the query letter. Sometimes I got rejected at the partial. Sometimes I got rejected at the full novel. So the full novel obviously takes an agent a little bit longer to get through to reject. But it took about 4 months to get that first acceptance.
Were you getting any good feedback from agents when you would get rejections, or were they just flat out rejections, or were there?
They were usually, most of them were just form rejections. Dear sir, ma'am, we hate your story, don't do us again, editor. But occasionally that editor might give you that little pat on the back. They'll write something on that rejection letter. I like that one character, Jim. The rest of your novel still sucks. But you can survive a long time on a little pat on the back. But some rejections were not particularly kind. I mean, let me backtrack a little bit to one gentleman that did take the time to write me that little pat on the back. It was basically 3 words that he hand wrote on the back of the standard rejection slip. It was, "This is unpublishable." I thought, well, it's nice of them not only to reject me, but take the extra special time to kick me in the nuts besides. But thank you, sir. I still have that rejection letter. It's from a certain St. Martin's Press editor who occasionally I still see at conferences occasionally.
I love it.
I've been needling him constantly for the last 2 decades.
Oh man, send him a Christmas card.
A little bit of encouragement occasionally, but eventually I got that agent to saw something in that rough draft to see if she can get it sold, and she did.
You said that when you kind of everything happened at once for you, and you're writing thrillers and fantasy novels at the same time. Do you approach those 2 genres differently when you begin one or the other? Is the thought process, the planning process different for you?
I don't know the planning part. I mean, obviously, when you're writing a fantasy novel, it doesn't require quite as much research as it does one of my modern-day thrillers, because you got to make sure you get every little detail correct in a modern-day thriller. Because, if somebody says, hey, he got put that Starbucks on the wrong corner, they're going to let you know it. So every little detail needs to be mapped out. Whereas with fantasy, obviously you do need there's certain things you need to educate yourself about. But once you've educated yourself on, what's the proper care and maintenance of a horse, if you're going to have a fantasy set in a world where horses are your main means of transportation. And once you know that. But ultimately, they are very different animals. My staccato-paced thrillers are a very different structure than my world-building fantasy. The fantasies are tendency to be longer novels. I would say my typical fantasy is generally about a good 50% longer than my typical Sigma Force novel. And that's what fantasy readers like. They want to be immersed in that world. So you need to create that world, which is challenging, because when you're creating a fantasy world, you need to inhabit it with a history and a past, and things need to make sense from a logic standpoint. You need to build that world from the ground up, and that takes a lot of brain power, some thought, and some sketching and mapping. So, and also the writing process themselves is very different. My thrillers are more staccato paced, whereas my fantasies are a little bit slower, a little bit richer in prose than the lean and mean thrillers. So they're definitely 2 different birds.
Right. The new book, the Demon Crown, is obviously a Sigma Force novel, and that's what we're here to talk about today. So I don't want to dig too deep into fantasy, although I'm a big fan of the fantasy as well. But the Sigma Force novels are really interesting to me in that a lot of these thriller novels that occupy some of the same genre space are focused around a character a lot of times. You've got a Jason Bourne, you've got a you've got a Jack Reacher, you've got, these types of character situations, whereas Sigma Force is a group of people. And what were your initial thoughts about creating Sigma Force, and kind of where did those initial ideas come in?
Well, I was resisting doing a series under my thriller pen name because my fantasy was a series, so I didn't want to do a series here too. And I had an issue with ongoing serial characters similar to Jason Bourne or James Bond for that matter, where this one character is constantly running into problems. It's what I call a Jessica Fletcher syndrome. Jessica Fletcher from Murder, She Wrote. Here is a woman that week after week is stumbling over dead bodies. I've never stumbled over a dead body myself, but she sure does. And eventually, the suspension of disbelief becomes a bit strained. Like, why is this woman always stumbling over dead bodies? And it's also hard to maintain jeopardy with this series character because you might be watching an episode and somebody has a gun against Jessica Fletcher's head, but that trigger's never going to be pulled because there's an episode next week. Right. So it's hard to maintain that jeopardy with that. And so, to me personally, I think the final resolution that would have satisfied me for the Murder, She Wrote series would be the revelation that Jessica Fletcher was a serial killer and that she's been murdering people all along and framing people. Then it would make sense. But so I
would watch that series.
So would I. That would make sense. But so I resisted initially doing a series, and then when I wrote Sandstorm, where Sigma Force, which I always just sort of describe as the prequel to the actual Sigma Force series, because it's Sigma Force is almost a tangential set of characters in that book. But I thought this is pretty cool. Here you have these sort of field agents for DARPA, the Defense Department's research and development. These scientists with guns that protect our coast against various threats. That'd be fun to maybe build a series around them, and I don't have to do it around just one character. I could do it around a group. That way I get around some of that Jessica Fletcher syndrome, and that the jeopardy can hit different characters in different ways, so the jeopardy can come from many different directions. But also I can maintain that jeopardy because with a cast of characters or a circle of characters, no one is necessarily safe in that I can knock off a major player, but Sigma Force can always recruit a new member. So I like that fact that I can maintain jeopardy that way. So, getting it, once I was satisfied that this was a way for me to get around that Jessica Fletcher syndrome, I talked to my agent and my editor and said, hey, I like Sigma Force, maybe we can spin them off into a series. And they were thrilled because they've been pushing me to do a series since almost my first book.
Nick Breaker's book Essence, Book 1 Septima, one of the best science fiction writers I know. Nick Breaker weaves some of the best science fiction adventure stories you'll ever read. Essence, Book 1 Septima is a must-read. Go pick it up today. There's a link to it in the show notes. Third Scribe is the place for authors and readers to meet. Go to ThirdScribe.com. You can set up an account for free, and you can link up with some of your favorite authors and find out what's going on with them. Authors, you need to have a place where you can highlight your books to your audience. ThirdScribe.com is built especially around books, linking people that love books with people that write books. Go visit them today. ThirdScribe.com. Tell Rob and the folks that I sent you. Tales from the Canyons of the Damned. Episode 20 just dropped today. It is amazing with stories by Jess West, Rhett Bruno, Eamon Ambrose, Bob Williams. Tales is my favorite monthly publication. Go pick it up today and get that old pulp goodness feeling. Tales from the Canyons of the Damned, episode number 20, out right now. Chronicle World's Tales of Dystopia, 13 stories of animals and humans interacting at the end of the world. This project also benefits Pets for Vets, one of the most outstanding charities out there, linking up rescue animals with veterans that need some companionship. So go pick up a copy of Chronicle World's Tales of Dystopia. It's only 99 cents while it launches. At the end of the show, don't forget we have an audiobook clip from Richard Cleaves, the Jason Crane series. The Sigma Force books deal with, and we talked about this earlier, a bit of historical fiction, a bit of cutting-edge science fiction, a bit of conspiracy, a bit of political intrigue. How do you, when I approach one of your new books, I'll read the historical setup, and then you'll have the kind of science setup, and I'm always thinking, like, how in the world is he going to tie these two things together? And you never let me down. How do you find these disparate, seeming, topics and weave them together? Are you always looking for weird historical things, and what's your research process like for these books?
Well, it's ongoing and continuous. Matter of fact, just this afternoon I was sifting through a bunch of magazines that had accumulated on my desk, and what I do basically, I'm just looking for three things. I'm looking for that historical mystery, that piece of history that maybe ends in a question mark that I can try to solve within the pages of a novel. I'm looking for that bit of science that makes you go, what if? Where's that headed? Is there any way that I could build an exciting story around? I'm looking for some interesting locales, somewhere I can crash those two things together. And I just accumulate them. I don't have any. I wish there was a better structure around it. The one question I always hate that always comes up in the Q&A during a book talk is, so a hand will raise and say, where do you get your ideas from? And I just don't know, because it seems a bit magical in that I just have and I'm looking at it right now, it's one of those cardboard lawyer's boxes where I throw these articles or these little, maybe I'm watching the Discovery Channel, the National Geographic Channel, and something I'll make some notes from a show I'm watching and I'll throw it into the box. It's messy, there's no order to it. I like that chaos, because it's from that chaos that my story ideas arrive. So what I have to do is I want to keep it to one box. And I subscribe to this point, I think, close to 20 different magazines that hit my doorstep. National Discovery, Scientific America, New Scientist, on and on. So it has a tendency to get full fast. So what I generally do is about once a month, I will dump the entire box and I will sift through it. Look, gosh, has Steve Barry covered this history element? I can throw this out. As, Michael
you got to watch Steve.
Exactly. So it helps me, thank goodness that's done, so I can get rid of that. And in the process of culling through that is often what will happen is either, laying on the floor next to each other or in my hand happenstance at the same time. This bit of history and this bit of science will end up next to each other, and I'll begin to see a connection between the two. And then I will do some research, and I'll find out either it'll snowball into a novel or it'll wither and die, and then I can, again, get rid of those objects. But it's that sort of magical process of just serendipity and happenstance that will bring those two diverse elements together, where I can suddenly see, because nowhere my own imagination would have connected those two. It just happened that they were in my hand at the same time that became the seed of the story.
One of my favorites is The Devil Colony, and I've heard a lot of people say that book is one of their favorites as well. And you've got this really great storyline of Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, and the Mormon settlers, and Native American Indians, and future tech that all come together in a brilliant way. I would love to see you do more of the early American history. Do you have plans to do anything else in that realm?
Well, it just happens that's what you'll be reading my next book next winter.
Ooh, nice.
Dealing with starting with the Salem witch trials, and the title of the book is "The Hammer of Witches."
Oh, nice.
I'll give you just one intriguing fact. I'll share this.
Okay.
With you.
Okay.
You know that there actually is a patron saint of witches, and not against witches, actually to protect witches. Actually, there's a Spanish saint, Saint Columba, that is the patron saint of witches. She is a saint that is supposed to protect witches. Now, this is in the same country, and she came about the same time that the Spanish Inquisition was occurring. So, again, those little pieces of history that just intrigue me. Is here we have the ongoing Spanish Inquisition, where they're putting witches to stakes and hanging them and torturing them. Yet at the same time, this patron saint of witches appears out of nowhere.
Interesting. You have my interest peaked already. Oh man. So the Demon Crown is the book that's releasing now. What is the setup for this book?
Well, to quote my editor, and she considers it one of my most frightening books to date, and I'm not going to disagree with her. of course. But the story starts when it's a group of scientists. They travel to an island off the coast of Brazil. They discover that all life has been eradicated off that island. It's been consumed by a species that's strange and bizarre. But before they can report the discovery, they're attacked and killed. But this one event blows up into this big global threat, and when the same species is released across the Hawaiian Islands. And as people die by the hundreds, the question becomes, do we nuke the islands to keep this from spreading? But of course, Sigma Force is called in to try to figure out where this species came from, and of course to find a way to destroy it. And but the species is very clever. It's changing and spreading and surviving so far every attempt to stop it. So that's basically the gist of the book. Why it's probably the most frightening is that even the Homeland Security has classified the threat that I raised in this novel to be one of their top priorities. Now, what that is, I'm not going to tell you.
One of the characters that's referenced in this book is Alexander Graham Bell. How does he come into it?
Well, again, he's again a little bit of my history element to the story. Sigma Force, their headquarters is located beneath the Smithsonian Castle next to the National Mall. And so, again, part of my little collection of notes was a lot of stuff about the Smithsonian Castle and its history. And it has sort of an intriguing history, is that the Smithsonian was founded based upon the bequeathment of a British chemist named James Smithson, hence the Smithsonian Institution. And after he died, he left his inheritance, and including his mineral collection, to the United States. And there's a lot of mystery surrounding James Smithson, mostly because he had never set foot in the U.S. He spent time in Europe and grew up in England, yet he ended up leaving his inheritance to this new nation. The question then is, why did he do that? And then it's further mystified that, or adding to the mystery rather, is that there was a fire that burned down most of the Smithsonian Castle during the Civil War and ended up destroying most of James Smithson's notes and books. And so his legacy was pretty much erased by that fire. And then even more intriguing is that upon James Smithson's death, he was buried in Genoa, Italy, and that grave eventually became under threat of being destroyed, demolished. And so Alexander Graham Bell, the inventor of the light bulb, basically approached the Smithsonian Regents and said, hey, maybe we should preserve this gentleman's remains since he was kind enough to leave his inheritance to us. The Regent said, no, don't bother. Alexander Graham Bell took it upon himself. He traveled with his wife to Genoa, Italy, under a cloak of secrecy, and lies for that matter. He claimed that he was traveling under the orders of the president, which was not true. He bribed people, a lot of subterfuge, but eventually on a snowy New Year's Eve, he went to that graveyard, unearthed the bones of James Smithson, put him into a zinc coffin, and transferred him to the United States, where now those bones reside in a crypt inside the Smithsonian Castle. So again, it's just me being the thriller writer. I'm wondering why all that skullduggery, and what was going on with that. Why was it seemingly that first, why did James Smithson leave his inheritance to us? Was there some reason why that fire seemed to specifically target James Smithson's books and journals and mineral collection? And then why was it so important to recover the remains of James Smithson from that Italian cemetery?
Intriguing. Why did you decide to base Sigma Force at the Smithsonian? That was something obviously important to you early on in the life of Sigma Force.
Well, Sigma Force, again, they're sort of like I said before, the scientists with guns. So I thought, it'd be, the Smithsonian Castle's right on the edge of the National Mall. So they're within the arm's breadth of the White House, of Capitol Hill, but also the many Smithsonian laboratories and research facilities. So it's be a great resource for them. So I went around. I was looking for I went to travel to D.C. and I was looking around where could I put Sigma Force in this area, and I found out that there was a set of old World War II bunkers beneath the Smithsonian Castle that were abandoned and boarded up, and no one had access to them anymore. So I thought, well, that would be a perfect place to eventually be developed into the secret headquarters of Sigma Force.
Wow. Are there any new characters, new members of Sigma Force that you brought in to this book?
In this book, we're pretty much sticking with the same group of characters, but they recruit several new helpers for this. One is an entomologist out of the National Zoo. Another one is a Hawaiian firefighter. How and why those two are recruited, I'm not going to tell you.
You talked about the Jessica Fletcher problem earlier, and and bringing a group of people definitely helps with that problem. But do you find yourself growing too attached to the group of people, even though you've got more than one to give you some freedom there? But they, with each writing, I'm assuming that the characters become more and more a part of you and become attached to you. Do you still have those same problems with characters, even though you've got a group?
I mean, I definitely have grown attached to my characters, and one of the ways I try to keep the stories fresh is that different novels will shine a stronger spotlight onto different characters. In my book, The Bone Labyrinth, I shone a big spotlight on Kowalski, who had never been a point of view character, but was a member of Sigma Force. So that's the first time he became a point of view character. Another book, I'll maybe shine light more on Monk and Cat's relationship. Another book, I might shine more on Gray and Shoshone. So it varies on where that spotlight shifts depending upon the novel. So some characters fade out of the picture for a novel, and they'll come back in another novel. So I like that dynamism in that it's the way life is. Nothing is static in life, and sometimes we're busier with our own family matters, so we're not pulled to the forefront. But at the same time, I like there's a Gray was battling for a long period of time the fact that his parents were dealing with Alzheimer's, and so we saw him trying to balance his professional and personal life. He's trying to save the world at the same time he's trying to deal with parents that are beginning to have debilitating issues and more demands upon his time. And we as human beings experience on a daily basis, so I think that's one of the ways that hopefully my readers can appreciate that too, and it's one way to get them more to bond to my characters is by having them be human.
And it definitely keeps the story fresh by, you never know with each book kind of who the focus is going to be and what strong suits that those particular characters are going to bring to the story, because that becomes part of the telling of the story, is that each character has a different role to play, which is always fascinating to see how you bring it out. Not only do you have this great strong set of characters in Sigma Force, but you've got this this other side, the kind of dark, secretive group lurking in the background in a lot of your novels as kind of their foil. How did you come to create them, and what is their thread throughout the stories?
Well, there is sort of a shadowy organization called the Guild, and their name actually was just assigned to them. No one actually knows what this group is really called, what they internally call themselves. They were called that because one of their symbols looks vaguely like the Masonic Guild symbol. And so it's been I almost wanted to create the equivalent of Spectre for James Bond. I wanted to create this sort of shadowy organization that no one knows about, but I also wanted to have them have a scientific and historical element. And so it was a great deal of fun sort of teasing out the development of the Guild, seeing the downfall of the Guild, and potentially in this book you're starting to see the resurgence of a new form of the Guild arising in this book.
Interesting. So the Guild has been behind a lot of things that have happened in history. Do you pull on historical facts to kind of assign things for the Guild?
Oh, definitely. I mean, a lot of the times I'll come across a historical mystery that ends in a question mark, like I was saying, and oftentimes I'm going to say, okay, well, that's the answer is the Guild many times, and so I can sort of tag those historical elements as being, can I build a story if the Guild did this? How is that going to have repercussions in modern times? And can I build a novel around that? And oftentimes I'll find out again, similar to before, it'll wither up and die. Other times I'll go, oh my gosh, that's really, really cool if this happened. And then we see that echo into the present day and what that means today.
You said that you plan your novels pretty meticulously, and you've got your system of coming up with facts that you sort through and find things that will find a thread of working together. Once you've kind of nailed down those initial issues, what is your planning process like for laying out the novel before you actually begin writing it?
Again, I don't allow myself 90 days of research. On the 91st day, I actually have to put pen to paper. Otherwise, at that point, beyond that, I'm just playing. And so, to me, during that 90 days is when I do my research on the history, I do my research on the science, I do my research on locations, and then I'll begin structuring the story. I'll know the beginning, I'll know the end, oftentimes I know the last line before I know the first line. And I'll know the three big tent poles that are going to hold up that story. But I don't know how A connects to B connects to C. To me, I've tried that before. I've tried, outlining as some authors do. Notoriously, some people will outline an entire novel to a T to the point all they have to do is throw in dialogue and be done. I'm not that type of author. To me, I find if I know the story that well, I will get bored with it when I write it. To me, the fun of being a writer is discovering that path between those tent poles to find out what happens. Oftentimes things happen that surprise me that I was not expecting. Sometimes some days it's like pulling teeth. I just know, I don't know how to get this out of this jam, but I like when I paint my characters into a corner, because if I don't know how to get them out of the corner, neither are you. So it's, oftentimes I'll be stuck for a day or two just trying to think, that's a really cool, problem I got them into. I just don't know how to get them out. So I'll have to spend some time trying to figure out what that is. But to me, that's one of the fun of being a writer is painting your characters into the corner and then trying to figure out how to get them out of it. So that's pretty much, my setup is I'll do my research, I'll know my beginning, my end, and my tent poles, and then I begin writing.
And if you've given yourself 90 days of research, you pretty well have all the set pieces in mind that you can. It's not like you're just going in blindly and just looking at a map and saying, "Oh, I'm going to grab this place at random and then see what the characters do." You're in a sense outlining, or not outlining, but filling your kind of workspace in your head with all of the details that you can just pull out as you need them. I think that's a process that a lot of writers use. You kind of had some marks along the map, and I know my characters need to get here, here, and here. I just don't know how they're going to get there, what they're going to do between pieces. I think a lot of writers are that way.
Well, again, I think some authors, I always describe someone like writing without a net. And, I've had 10 panels where there's been, 3 outliners on the panel and 3 sort of free writers that just don't want to know anything. They just want to look at a blank sheet of paper and write their story. Now, neither way is wrong. It just, again, but what usually happens by the end of that panel, they're in a fist fight because their brains are wired so differently. So, I don't think either way is wrong. This is just a method I found that works for me. The joy of my writing is to have a little bit. I want a little bit of a net, but not that strong of a net underneath me. I need to know at least where this train is going to end up. I might not know all the tracks to get there, but I at least need to know where I'm going to end, so that when I'm writing my novel, at least I have a flag in the distance that's waving that I know where to go to.
The new novel is called The Demon Crown. It's out December 5th. You said that you've got the Salem Witch Trial book that's coming out next winter. Is that book fully drafted by now?
It's about, I would say, like 80% done.
Gotcha.
I still have some areas I need to work on still.
Gotcha.
Close.
If someone's not familiar with your books, what do you hope they come away with when they've got a Sigma Force novel, and what is your hope for them as the writer?
Well, at the end of all my novels, I have sort of a what's true and what's not section, where I sort of pull away the curtain a bit at the end, and I sort of explain how much of the story is real and how much is fiction. Mostly I did that because I got tired of answering a bunch of emails. Is this part true? Is that part true? Is this, where do you make that up? And mostly because I got a 1-star review on Amazon at one point where it said, I love Jim's book. I feel like at this point of the story where he said this and that was so outlandish, it pulled me out of the story, I couldn't finish it. And I'm thinking, well, that part was true. I'm going to take you somewhere, sir. I admit that. That part that you're pointing to is actually a fact. That's real. So I sort of, at the end of the novel, I lay out what's true and what's not, so that if anybody has any curiosity about the subject matters that I raised in the novel, I leave those breadcrumbs at the end so that they want to follow them. So to me, always the greatest compliment I get from a reader would be when they get an email saying, hey, I was intrigued by this part of the story, and I saw you mention this book, or that you went here to learn about this information. And so I went and got that book, or I went over there and looked at that, or I went over and to this museum that you talked about and saw this thing. To me, that's really I love the interaction that way, where the book has not just served as popcorn entertainment, but has affected somebody enough that they wanted to pursue their own level of inquiry.
Yeah,
that's me.
Absolutely. Are you working on anything besides Sigma Force these days?
We're putting together an anthology of all the short stories I was telling you about. At this point, I think I've gotten about 18 short stories that are in a scatter of different venues and formats. There's a lot of ebooks out there, a lot of ebook short stories, but also there's a few anthology stories scattered across different books. And so we're going to put them all into one big book. But I don't want to just try to sell somebody a retread of short stories out there. So we're also including a 140-page Tucker and Kane story. Tucker and Kane. Tucker is a spin-off from my Sigma series. He's a Army Ranger who's paired up with his military war dog, who gets into all sorts of mischief. And why I like that is in the Tucker and Kane books, excuse me, I write scenes from the dog's point of view, which to me as a veterinarian is a great deal of fun. I don't want to do a Disney version of a dog that sings and dances during some part of the novel. I try to pull on my veterinary background from animal behavior, from what I've learned talking to military men and military handlers and their experiences with their dogs, to try to create a real sort of three-dimensional military working dog. So we're going to see the 2 novels featuring those 2 characters, and I'll be doing this novella that will be included with the short story collection.
Excellent. We're going to send everybody to go pick up a copy of The Demon Crown. And James, if people are not familiar with your work, where can they find you online to connect with you and to kind of dig into your back catalog?
Well, for sort of an encyclopedia of my books, and I also have a lot of Q&As in there, and even hints on how to on writing. It's just on my website, jamesrollins.com. But where I spend most of the time usually is on social media, mostly Facebook or Twitter. You can find me there too, more on the sort of day in, day out, what it means to be a writer, what it means to... If you want to see pictures of my dog, come to Facebook.
Excellent.
Laying at my feet right now, looking at me.
Oh, James, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
What in the name of Carl Sagan was he doing in the cemetery on Halloween? What was he thinking? He whirled, expecting the Headless Horseman himself to be waiting on the road ahead. Or was he lurking behind? He wanted to run. But now the bridge ahead worried him. Doesn't the horseman haunt bridges? Could he avoid crossing it somehow? It terrified him. Why? It was just a stupid bridge. The gloom beneath could have been the lair of a troll. Billy Goat's Gruff. Mama used to read that. The troll waits beneath for the fattest, sweetest goat. Jason thought he saw something on the far end of the bridge, a shape of some sort. He stepped onto the bridge and gripped the knotty railing. He felt the ground drop away beneath as he edged forward. His eyes remained on the shape. It's nothing. It's nothing. Is it nothing? No troll attacked him as he reached the other shore. The looming shape was only a stupid stairwell opposite the bridge that climbed up the hill and into the main cemetery. He turned left and ran, admitting defeat and letting the fear take him over. He ran southward down the long, dark road. His initial burst of adrenaline ran its course, and he slowed, then walked again, limping a little. Headstones slipped past on the right. He still had enough light that he caught his reflection occasionally in the polished stone. He looked very young and very thin. He could feel his vulnerability as he walked along. He grew aware of his own body, the touch of his starchy dress shirt and his jacket and the soft weight of his backpack. He saw himself reflected in the headstones, just a container of warm fluids, flimsy work for a blade or a hoof or a sword. He felt shatterable and transient, and his next breath was not guaranteed, oh no. The leaves made a faint oceanic rustle all around. The insects sang their three-note songs. Jason Crane, Jason Crane, Jason Crane. Jason sang a wretched pop song as he walked, something about having no self-control and no bitches and not enough money. He sang it softly, absent-mindedly, as if reciting a psalm. He passed Reese, Finnerton, Bain, Ekdal, Forest, Black, Small. There. He saw the gate at the end of the road. But the gate would be locked, he remembered. He would have to climb the embankment and cross over the churchyard. He could see the spire of the church above and the weather vane spinning against the sky. He would rather climb this gate than face that churchyard, but the spikes on top made leaping the fence impossible. Okay, just be quick. Something caught his ear, a brittle, clipping sound. He scanned the crest above and saw a horse silhouetted among the graves. It looked to be tied to a branch of the locust tree. He had heard its hooves as it shifted from foot to foot. It rustled somehow. His breath caught. He forced himself to be calm and rational. Some Halloween thing, maybe, for some event. He found the stairs and ascended, sideways, ready to bolt if necessary. He watched the horse, but when he neared the top he saw the rider, standing upon the shallow depression of the horseman's grave. The figure was motionless, a dim shape that absorbed light and gave nothing back. He could make out the shape of the boots and the legs and two arms held away from the body, palms down. Just a man? But the cape of the thing was not normal. It contorted painfully, twisting in the air even though the wind wasn't blowing. It wrung itself and billowed and whipped slowly, as if the figure wore a wave torn from a black ocean. And above its shoulders, is he headless? Is he headless?